Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. An opportunity has arisen for me to be able to finally, after all these years, watch a documentary that I was so keen to watch when it was released, and yet, for whatever circumstances, meant that I wasn't able to see it in the cinema. But finally, I was able to see Asif Kapadia's Amy. And this is definitely a documentary I've wanted to talk about for a while. I, in fact, almost many months ago attempted to cover one of his other documentaries, his latest, Diego Maradona. Unfortunately, as I think I mentioned at the time, it transpired that that documentary is very, very heavily in Spanish. And consequently, I hadn't quite facilitated the circumstances by which I could watch it. But I do think this is... I find him a fascinating documentarian because I suppose there are two characters in any documentary: the subject and the filmmaker. Because, frankly, the documentaries where the filmmaker tries to be completely objective or completely take themselves out of the narrative are ultimately the weaker documentaries. And with Amy specifically, although I'm fairly confident it's probably true with Senna and with Diego Maradona, the way that Asif Kapadia approaches telling the story is through the perspective of someone who has an emotional investment in their subject. And so even though he is one of those filmmakers who never appears on camera, you feel his emotional state represented through the way that he depicts the visuals, or the way that he frames the interviews, the tone of it. It just bleeds this sense of melancholy and pathos, and the idea of someone who did meet and briefly work with Amy before her death, because he was originally making a documentary about Amy, and it's only when he came back in 2015, 4 years after his death, that he actually decided to make the documentary about her life as a whole. And, you can see the sort of sense of him almost wanting to scream out of the lens of the camera at the tragedy of this, and how the culpability of it and the sense of injustice for the death of a young woman who, frankly, was a victim of... Well, we'll elaborate on that because it's a complex question, and I think he does really try to delve deep into what exactly is the source cause of it, if there is one. I'm going to take a sidebar for a second and talk about drama narratives, because I have extensively, over the last several videos, talked about fate and fatal, and the idea that, particularly with tragedy narratives, going all the way back to Greek playwrights, you have that way that, a tragedy should be the kind of story where you look at certain moments. There are certain lines that characters deliver, certain plot points where things could have gone differently. And the whole point of a tragedy narrative is that you sit there and look at the moments and think, oh, if this hadn't happened this way, or if this character hadn't suggested it, the idea of, oh, was our hero fated to fail, to die in most cases, or was there hope for them, under other circumstances, and that's the whole point of analysing fictional tragedy narratives. However, this is someone's real life. This is, someone who lived in our world, and this isn't a story. This is things that happened to her. And I think it makes it all the more complicated because there isn't a sense of structure, a sense of pacing. I mean, Asif Kapadia really does try to, because he's a filmmaker, he obviously tries to pace out her story in a way that fits a film format. But ultimately, because this is someone's life and there are ups and downs and there's no sense of pacing or structure to it, our desire as humans, and that sort of feeds into why we like tragedy stories, is that we want to find meaning and structure. Our brains, are drawn to pattern recognition, and therefore, when when we look at something like a biopic, a documentary, biographical documentary, not a biopic, we are drawn to the idea of there being a certain story for this person, and unfortunately, that isn't always the case. And I think the great question that Asif Kapadia is asking in this documentary is, was this avoidable? What were the things that led to Amy's death? And, could these things have been, could these things have been circumnavigated, and could she have been some great successful artist without essentially having to give herself to it, sacrifice her life for the purposes of art? I want to talk about the documentary without restriction. So what I would say at this point is, yes, you should absolutely watch this documentary. It is one of the great documentaries of the modern age, and I definitely think it's worth. I think even if you don't know much about Amy Winehouse, even if you, aren't that invested in the story, or you're not interested in music documentaries, I think this is beyond that. I think this is a very powerful piece of filmmaking, and as I say, there's, the raw emotions of the filmmaker are so strong that you go through an emotional experience yourself as a viewer, or via empathy you do, obviously. That's not a given, but the point being is that this doesn't just try to teach, it tries to make you feel, and feel quite complex emotions, and I think that's what makes it such a great documentary. So absolutely you should watch this. But wanting to go deeper into it, I'm obviously wanting to talk about it sort of top and tail. So from this point on, I'm going to talk about several of the beats in it and several of the questions posed, and really examine some of the things that Asif Kapadia really sort of focuses on. And of course, this is someone's life, so this is a historical event. So it's a spoiler in terms of the narrative, but obviously it's it's not a spoiler because human lives aren't spoilers, and most people know that Amy Winehouse dies. But as I said, culpability, I think, is really the sort of primary question, and the idea of, did Amy do this to herself? Was this something that she should have taken? That she can't take responsibility because she's not alive anymore. But was the responsibility with her for her own mental health, her own addictions, and her own self-destructive behaviour? Was it the responsibility of the public and the media? Because there is a long section of this and specifically towards the end, where it examines the way that we treated her and examined her societally. She was constantly in the limelight, full time. There was never a point in which she wasn't, being, taken by, paparazzi constantly taking photos of her, and people trying to start fights with her because it's sells well, and of course people making fun of her in media because she was a cheap shot. And he sort of does point to us as the audience, or for people who remember it, saying, was that sense of almost like baiting something that we fueled, and it became cyclical, that she got more and more pestered and bothered, and like most celebrities have to live their lives not being able to sort of go down the street. But was her sort of, the fact that we wanted to see more of her and sort of feed off of sort of, her self-destructive cycle, which meant that obviously more people were constantly wanting to take photos and to get interviews, and then of course, that kind of kept her constantly in the limelight, less about her music and more about her struggle. And the idea is, again, are we therefore responsible for the fact that she needed help, but that was something that wasn't being addressed. It's not the core of it, but it's definitely a section that is discussed. I mean, I think on some level there are sort of three. If you sort of take the media and the public aside, and consider them one character, but just push them aside for the moment, there are three primary characters who seem to be the focus of the documentary, which is her father, Mitchell Winehouse, and his influence on her life, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes directly. Then there is her ex-husband, Blake, Fielder Civil, who, frankly, he might not bear the entirety of responsibility, but he does bear a huge amount of responsibility. And we'll get into why in a second. And then there is Amy herself, and as I say, the question of, was she a self-destructive personality who, caused her own downfall and addiction cycle? And I think it does do a good job at trying to examine. I mean, both Mitchell and Blake are part of the documentary. They are interviewed, which is a huge get, considering how accusatory the subtext of the narrative is. And obviously they wouldn't know going into the interview. But, the fact that they do give these frank interviews about their experiences, and then, and then at the same time, they're being sort of attacked. The sort of narrative sort of does point out that they directly or indirectly caused a lot of her pain. And then, of course, the third being Amy herself. And, we see issues that are, 2015 is, mental health was still a major conversation even then. But, there was still this issue of, she was bulimic by the age of 9. And then got into sort of, light drugs sort of in her teenage years as she was going off the rails a little bit. But even then, the issues didn't start until after. I mean, she already demonstrated an addictive personality, and of course they speak to her friends like her old flatmates, like Jackie and Lauren, her old manager who was her friend and was kind of an amateur himself, who kind of came into the industry, this guy Nicky. And the fact that he tells a story where basically the end of their working relationship was when he tried to take her to rehab, and of course the song Rehab comes from this. It's almost practically the song, which is he was trying to force her to go to rehab, which she seemed unsure but keen to do, but then wanted to speak to her father, and her father, Mitch, basically said, you don't need rehab, you'll be alright. And of course, once he said that fueled her to not go. And then Nikki basically said, well, I will not work with you, I won't watch you, and this is between the albums Frank and Back to Black, so she's known, but she's not famous. And, and there's a real pause when he's discussing that, about the idea that he outlines that this, that she was going to be successful, and this was the last opportunity before fame and public attention would fuel the things that were already wrong, hence, aka her addictive personality. And like I say, Blake sort of comes in and out of her life, but he is the one who introduced her to hard drugs, and yet, like, as I say, takes no responsibility for the fact that, you know, she became addicted to heroin and to crack cocaine because of him. And, you know, and sort of they developed very similarly to Whitney and Bobby Brown. If you watch the documentary Whitney, how they became this sort of codependent substance abuse fueled relationship, you know, and you know, and you have this brilliant person who's sort of being tied in with this person who is self-destructive. And of course, the documentary even discusses the fact that Blake and Amy were drawn to each other because they were both incredibly self-destructive personalities, even as teenagers, and they were, you know, she sort of was attracted, and you see clips of her sort of discussing the fact that, you know, she and him were connected by the fact that they had these really difficult, dark sides to them, to their characters. But as I say, he, you know, his choices massively negatively impacted her. But yeah, and it discusses all these quite complex aspects of her life because, you know, on one level, the interesting thing is the fact that she never really wanted to be famous. It was very clear the fact that, you know, there's so much video footage. This is definitely the case of someone who, you know, even before she was famous and was a teenager, was filming herself, and this is sort of just before the social media age really sort of hit off, but, you know, was filming herself and being filmed by family, and there are all these clips of her, and you see, you know, this sort of light, bubbly, sort of North London girl, who was a great musician, then transition into someone who becomes a professional musician, but still has some of her fun aspects, but obviously is slightly being weighed down. And then when she becomes incredibly famous, basically there aren't any more home movies. They're all, you know, all the clips, and this film is made up of archive footage, home movies, interviews. You know, there are no more home movies. It's all just footage about her, because the assumption is that she sort of lost herself a little bit, and, you know, the camera was on her so much that she wouldn't want to electively have it on her even more. But yeah, and you know, there is that sense where there's a section where it talks about her artistry and the way her attitude to music, and on some level, it's, you know, as I say, she didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to be a really, you know, a good musician, and she was a great jazz musician. And if she hadn't have, you know, if she hadn't have taken off in the way that she did, and had just been a, you know, middle-level musician that people might have heard of in their particular scenes, that might have done her better. But then, you know, she still had the addictive personality. You know, she still drank like a fish, even though, you know, she was a bulimic, and obviously that's what eventually killed her. And so maybe, you know, that wouldn't have, you know, fame or no fame, that wouldn't have changed that aspect of her life. It's interesting. It is a genuinely thought-provoking documentary that's why I wanted to sort of discuss all these themes and ideas and turn over, because coming away from it, you just want to sort of uncover every aspect of it that it discusses. You know, the fact that, you know, despite the fact that, you know, she sort of burnt her friendship bridges, she was in a really bad way towards the end of her life. You know, the record label was still trying to send her out to do gigs, even though she wasn't in a state to do gigs. And that's, you know, a record label, obviously their main priority is the record label, but again, culpability, it's a difficult question. But you know, this is the kind of documentary that presents itself in a way that makes you want to think and consider, and it's so interesting. It's such a fascinating, you know, discussion piece and character study. Yeah, this is, like I say, a tremendous documentary. Truly tremendous. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because this all helps in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. And check out my back catalogue of 200 plus videos. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about films and TV shows, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.